Hello. This week, we're going to do a bit of detective work on a spoon. This spoon, it cropped up in a sale about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was a small private collection of early spoons. I must say most of them were pretty unexceptional. Some very tired London examples that barely scraped away. There was one interesting Norwich example, but that was in dreadful condition. It had breaks in the stem, wear to the bowl, and all sorts of things wrong with it, though I'm sure that will be sensitively restored and will be a few £1,000s if you're not careful. So do watch out for that. That was by Thomas Havers. And the marks weren't great. Although at £500, it was a piece of Norwich silver. It was I suppose it's a bargain for somebody that wanted a piece, or an opportunity for someone with a good restorer. And there was this. Now, I got frightfully excited about this. The estimate for it in the catalogue was so low, my jaw dropped open, and I honestly didn't expect, A, to buy it for within estimate, which I didn't, but I thought I may not buy it at all. And the reason was, if I turn it round, you'll see, or hopefully you'll see, is the absolutely breathtaking engraved decoration throughout this spoon. There is a period from, I suppose, about 1675, 1680, right up through about 1700, where some of the best Trefid spoons are absolutely smothered with this very detailed engraving, very fine scrollwork engraving. Front of the stem, back of the stem, back of the bowl. I think the back of the bowl is pretty much the most breathtaking part of this. Getting a lot of reflection, so I'll do this in close-up and hopefully you'll see it better. But there was a slight problem with the decoration. I wasn't entirely sure it was correct for the spoon. The one saving grace was it was catalogued as possibly provincial. It has 3 quite lightly struck impressions of marks here, and again we'll look at those in detail, but I did, thankfully, because of the shape of the punch more than anything else, because the marks inside are worn but readable, I didn't know exactly who it was the moment I saw it. And if you go back to one of the earlier videos looking at Exeter silver, you'll see an extremely rare little wine taster by John Avery with an IA punch. And the unusual feature about Avery's mark, this early mark, is it's in a sort of curved octagonal punch. Octagonal sides that slightly curve and point out. And no other maker's mark does that. No other British maker's mark. And this is exactly what we have here. We have an Exeter Trefid spoon, lovely Trefid spoon by John Avery, who was working from about 1689 and died in about 1703, 1704. This would date to about 1690, 1695 at the latest. So I was delighted to get it, and it was a bit dirty, and I cleaned it up. And as I was cleaning it up, I'd seen all this decoration in the photographs. I'd seen this slightly later date and initial. What I hadn't been able to see, and again we'll have to do this in close-up, is actually underneath this engraving there is an earlier prick dot engraved. So rather than line engraving with a fine engraver to do all this detailed work, it's simply stippling, but with a pin, almost with a pin, and you tap away and you make the initials. Now you can just make out the initials GK, the original initials, and little scrolls all the way round. Now the intriguing thing was that these little scrolls, this original engraving, prick dot engraving, was interrupted by this line that was contiguous with all of this decoration. So you might think initially, oh Michael, I bet you were disappointed that that decoration wasn't period with the spoon. And initially I was slightly, I thought, oh dear, it's not period. But then I thought, well, it must have been done because the lettering on the clearer engraving is exactly the same line and hand that has engraved this. It must have been done only 30 years later. So I picked over all this engraved decoration and I noticed something quite unusual. Now, normally when someone later decorates a spoon, they go for it. If you've seen berry spoons, which are the Victorian examples, or even late 18th century examples where they've been fettled and new crests have been put on, or a little bit of decoration has been tickled up, they don't really care about the marks that were there beforehand. They go all over them. They often obliterate them. What was very interesting, and it made me pause for a moment, is that although these three impressions of John Avery's mark running down the back of the stem are quite lightly struck, they're not the clearest mark in the world, there isn't one area or one part or 1 millimetre where this engraving that was done 30 years later than when this spoon was made goes over those marks. Those marks have been treated with deference and respect, and I've never seen that before, and that made me wonder. And this is the thing, normally this quality of decoration is not found on Exeter spoons. Nothing against Exeter silver. Most early 18th century Exeter silver is built like a tank and beautiful stuff. But you don't get this type of decoration. You associate it more with London and London spoons engraved by Huguenots. And certainly if a Huguenot had engraved this spoon, they certainly would have gone all over Avery's mark, not paying it any attention. But this was clearly done by somebody who was familiar with Avery's mark, to recognise it 30 years after it had been struck on the spoon, but also thought it important enough to preserve that. So what I think, or what I've deduced has happened to this, and it does genuinely make it more interesting than a period engraved spoon, is that this spoon had remained in a family. It had remained in a family since 1690, 1695. It had survived one generation, which when you're looking at the 17th and 18th century is typically a 35 year period. At that point, either people have passed on, or they've had children, or they refurbish their silver, but it tends to be, one generation tends to be about 35 years. And at that point, even when this spoon, this style of spoon, was deeply unfashionable in 1726, which is the date that's engraved on the back of this for the presentation, this spoon was not altered, as you might expect, to make it look like a Hanoverian pattern spoon. These weren't filed off or changed. The original prick dot engraving, lightly as it was done, was not erased. It was simply, I think, given possibly to one of Avery's apprentices or another local Exeter goldsmith to be improved as a presentation, either for a christening. There are two sets of initials, TP over MA. I've always thought that TP is the donor and MA is the recipient. From TP to MA, 1726. So it could be a christening spoon. It might, although I'm less inclined to believe this, be for a marriage or an engagement. So it would be the husband's initialed and then the wife's maiden names, but I'm not. Some people say that's the case. I prefer christening. But it was basically revamped. So this is like, similar to having an old car that you want to give away, and before you give it away, you get it serviced, you get everything done to it, and you might give it a respray so it looks as good as it possibly can. And this is what's happened here. And what's telling is that this style of engraving, this very foliate Huguenot decoration, was really not fashionable in London in 1726. Everyone was having beautiful, elegant Hanoverian pattern spoons with very discreet crests engraved on them if you had the money. They weren't having this very provincial early style of spoon, trefid spoons. They certainly weren't plastering them with engraved decoration. But in the West Country, that may still have been fashionable, or the height of fashion hadn't yet permeated that, and more glitz was better. So what we end up with is something I've never seen before, but a really interesting and superb example of an early trefid spoon made in Exeter in the West Country that has passed through two different silversmiths' hands. John Avery, who's made the spoon originally and marked it, and then possibly one of his apprentices, that the spoon has then been returned to, and it's been updated, it's been decorated. But what's also telling is that because this must logically be West Country decoration, it does show that they were capable of producing extremely fine engraving. And it may even have been a Huguenot goldsmith that had moved to the Exeter area. The quality of the engraving is that good. But we'll look at all of that in close-up. So that was a remarkable find. And it's a little bit of history in Exeter silver and Exeter silver spoons and their development. But just an absolutely wonderful thing. So it is all out there. You can still find it. Absolutely fantastic. So that was something fabulous. We'll do the close-ups in a minute, and you'll see properly how breathtaking the engraving is. And as I say, dated to 1726, just one generation after this spoon was made, and it's obviously been treasured since then. Nothing has happened to it. It's in absolutely wonderful condition. Fantastic thing. Glad to show it to you. I'll try and find something else for next week, but until then, goodbye and good antiques hunting.